Kierkegaard's final discourse in his book For Upbuilding Discourses is about the philosophical questions concerning the soul. He keeps using the Socratic method in this discourse. He initiates each discourse with a quote from the Bible that he subsequently addresses and interprets. And here the quote is from Luke 21:19, which is, "In your patience you will gain your souls." At first glance it looks harmless, but how can I gain my soul when I was born with it? And I know that patience is useful, but why is it important to gain one's soul? Kierkegaard begins with our common understanding of patience, where, for example, the wanderer knows that when he's off to a long trip, he shouldn't rush into it or he'll be exhausted midway, just as the fisherman needs to be patient while sitting in his boat. For them both, patience is a tool that will help them attain a certain goal or a certain possession. Understood that way, patience is a soul strength that everyone needs to attain what he desires in life. But this is not the kind of patience that Luke 21:19 refers to. First of all, the utility of the normal kind of patience is relative. Perhaps at times, impatience would be more profitable and would hasten the gain of what is coveted. The patient fisherman will look foolish in his little boat in comparison to the huge nets of his pragmatic colleague who just bulldozes through the ocean. The wanderer's or the fisherman's patience, therefore, depends on external criteria and varies from situation to situation. Now, if the Bible passage was referring to this kind of patience, then the possession of the soul would become a question of luck, or even worse, of divine selection, which is not only an elitist conception but that undermines the whole question of inwardness. If it completely relies on external criteria, the soul will become a mere thing among things. More importantly, it would presuppose that the soul is out there, possessed by someone else, so that we need to conquer it, meaning that our soul is originally not ours, which undermines the whole concept of selfhood. Yet, this external understanding of patience as mental strength is not just based on a confusion of outwardness and inwardness, but is fundamentally an error that we perpetrate constantly, namely in our dominant desire for possession, be it in the form of power, material goods, knowledge, or fame. Kierkegaard summarizes this in the desire to possess the world, but this desire is a complete exteriorization of oneself, which not only ends in failure, considering that external is always more powerful than me, but also in my complete reification, as I become fully entangled by material relations, dependent on outward forces. Kierkegaard says, in the first moment, then, a person is in a possession that people later crave as something glorious. He is lost in the life of the world. He possesses the world, that is, he is possessed by it. But in the same moment, he is different from the whole world, and he senses a resistance that does not follow the movements of the world's life. If he now wants to gain the world, he must overcome this disquiet until once again, like the undulation of the waves, he vanishes in the life of the world. Then he has won the world. However, if he wants to gain his soul, he must let this resistance become more and more pronounced, and in doing so, gain his soul. For his soul was this very difference. It was the infinity in the life of the world and its difference from itself. A human being is closest to being a material being in the moment it is born, completely dependent on external forces. But right from the start, there is a core difference between a human being and the world that needs to be strengthened and that becomes weakened in the pursuit of possessing the world. The desire to become more powerful is an attempt to control the physical, natural forces of the world. But how can we do that? Except by becoming such a force ourselves. By becoming more and more entangled in these external dynamics, the self reduces its difference to the world and only completes its dependence. Therefore, to strengthen the difference between me and the world, which is the essential core of selfhood, I need to go to the other way. I need to become weaker. But it's not that renouncement of mysticism that tries to overcome that fundamental difference between man and world, but rather a quest for something that is not dependent on outward forces, some sort of self-sufficiency. In short, inwardness. Kierkegaard says regarding this, therefore, to gain his soul was a task that announced a struggle with the whole world, since it began with letting a person be at the goal of that earthly craving, possessing the whole world in order to give it away. Kierkegaard warns us that understanding the possession of a soul analogously to the possession of a thing will result in the collapse of the category of inwardness and in the ultimate indifference between self and world, between man and thing. But how is the soul possessed then? It is possessed not as a thing, but as a task. He says, if a person possesses his soul, he certainly does not need to gain it. And if he does not possess it, how then can he gain it, since the soul itself is the ultimate condition that is presupposed in every acquiring, consequently also in gaining the soul? Could there be a possession of that sort which signifies precisely the condition for him being able to gain the same possession? In the external sense, there is no such possession. The person who possesses the external does not need to gain it, in fact. He is even unable to do that. He can give away what he possesses and then see whether he can gain the same thing again. He can use what he possesses to gain something new, but he cannot simultaneously possess and gain the very same thing. If there is any question of such a possession, then it must be found in the internal. If it is not to be found in the external as such, then it is not to be found in the temporal as such either, since, more closely defined, it was actually temporality that made it impossible to possess and to gain the external simultaneously, because that which is in the moment either is or is not, and if it is, then it is not gained, and if it is gained, then it is not. A self-contradiction, which enunciation of both these statements would be: temporality does not understand this either as a riddle or as the solution of the riddle. In the eternal, there is no self-contradiction, not because it, like the temporal, either is or is not, but because it is. The eternal is not either a something possessed or a something gained, but is only a something possessed that cannot be gained any more than it can be lost. Then this self-contradiction must be sought, if anywhere, in the eternal. After all, in its most universal expression, the soul. Lastly, he says that merely knowing the soul does not equate to gaining it. He says, but if a person is to gain his own soul, then he certainly must know it before he begins. This, of course, is true precisely because the person who knows his soul has still not therefore gained it, but it is precisely therefore also true that if he does not begin to gain it, he does not know it. Even if he could know it completely before he gained it in patience, this knowing would still be only a possessing, just like that first possessing, the condition for his being able to gain his soul in patience. This is why all knowing that is unrelated to a gaining is incomplete and deficient, inasmuch as a person still does not know how he becomes, since he becomes through the gaining, and even in association with the gaining he remains deficient, for we still do not know what we shall become. The person who knows his soul sees himself in a mirror, but he can forget what he looks like, as the Apostle James says, and therefore what he goes on to say is pertinent here, that the one who hears the word properly is the one who does it. As long as he merely hears the word, he is outside it, and when the proclaimer is silent, he hears nothing. But when he does the word, he continually hears what he himself is proclaiming to himself. And any mere hearing of the word is infinitely more imperfect than the doing, not only because the doing is superior, but because, in comparison with the exactitude of the doing, any oral communication is very imperfect, both in its brevity and in its prolixity. Therefore, knowledge of one's own soul, if one wants to regard it as a gaining, is a self-deception, because even in its greatest completeness, it still is but a hint of what manifests itself in its definiteness during the gaining.